Previously on Diverted Desires, a missed flight, a glass of wine, a moment that wasn't supposed to last, but refused to be forgotten. Julian and Noelle met by chance, strangers bound by timing, pulled together by something deeper. Through playful tension, emotional honesty, and the silence that followed, they wrote each other into places no one else had touched. But now, the story turns. No more hiding behind roles. No more waiting for the right words. This is where it gets real. This is where the letters become life. The silence becomes choice. And the final chapter begins, not on the page, but in the heart. Let's continue. Chapter 10. The Disappearance Weekend. They didn't call it a getaway. They didn't use words like vacation or retreat or escape. They simply referred to it as the weekend, and that was enough. Noelle had chosen the place. A minimalist cabin 2 hours outside the city, tucked just beyond a ridge of whispering trees, where phone signals died and clocks weren't welcome. There was a small kitchen, a fireplace that hissed when fed, and an old record player that crackled more than it sang. The rules were simple. No talk of the past, no devices, no names. They packed light. Not because they wanted to be practical, but because there was something sacred about traveling with only what you could carry in one hand and remember in your heart. Julian arrived first. He lit the fire, brewed tea, and waited. When Noelle appeared at the doorway, backlit by gray light and a scattering of mist, he didn't greet her. He didn't need to. The quiet between them said more than welcome ever could. They spoke little that first night, not out of tension, but because the space between them had grown comfortable, like breath or silence after an exhale. She cooked while he poured wine. He washed the dishes while she dried them. They didn't ask questions, didn't offer answers. They played music and listened. Not to the lyrics, to the pauses in between. That night, they sat on the floor near the fire, shoulders just touching. They weren't characters anymore, but they weren't fully themselves yet either. They were hovering in between, that delicate in-between that only exists when both people know something's coming, but choose not to rush it. She turned toward him, eyes reflecting the glow of firelight. "If this were a story," she said softly, "what would the next scene be?" Julian didn't answer right away. He just leaned his head back against the couch and closed his eyes. "She reaches for his hand," he said, "and he lets her." So she did. Fingers slid into fingers. Warm, unhurried, present. They stayed like that. No kiss, no climax, just contact. It wasn't about the drama. It was about the permission to feel something honest, without it needing to perform. Later, they shared the bed, but only to sleep. Two people wrapped in the same stillness, breathing the same quiet air. And, for the first time in a long time, neither of them dreamed. Chapter 11. One last roll. The second morning was colder. The sky hung low, draped in a quiet gray that made the cabin feel even more tucked away from the world. Noelle stood by the window, wrapped in a blanket, watching the trees sway. Julian sat at the table, pouring hot water over loose tea leaves, letting the steam rise and curl between them like a question neither had asked yet. They hadn't broken the rules, but rules don't keep you safe from feeling. And they had felt. More than either of them expected. More than they'd said. Noelle turned from the window and leaned against the wall. Her voice was steady, but not casual. "What if we did one more roll?" Julian looked up, his hand still wrapped around the mug. "You want to pretend again?" "No," she said. "Not pretend. Not this time. She crossed the room slowly. One last roll. But this one's honest. No escape, just the parts of us we usually hide. He nodded once. All right. Who are you? She breathed in, and then, softly, I'm the woman who left before you could ask me to stay. He didn't flinch. And I'm the man who convinced himself it didn't matter. Noelle sat across from him, eyes locked to his. She was scared, she said, because what she felt in one night, it made everything else in her life feel like a lie. Julian's hands tightened slightly around his cup. And he replied, told himself you were better off disappearing. Because if you stayed, he might have had to show you everything he hides from everyone else. She nodded once. What does he hide? He looked down, then up. The part of him that wants to be chosen, not for how interesting he is, but for how still he can make someone feel. The silence cracked between them, not broken, but bared. Noelle's voice was a whisper now. And what does she want? Julian answered gently. To be safe enough to stop performing. That was the moment it stopped being a game. Noelle stood and walked over to him. She didn't ask for permission. She just sat beside him, resting her head against his shoulder. And, for the first time, it wasn't character meeting character. It wasn't fantasy layered in poetry. It was her and him. And everything they had not said, said. They didn't need another scene. They didn't need more tension. This was the most naked they had ever been, and they hadn't even touched skin. Chapter 12. The Undoing. They didn't speak on the drive back, not out of discomfort, but because the silence between them had grown sacred. A soft hum filled the car, the same kind of hush that lingers after a symphony ends, before the applause. When they reached the edge of the city, Noelle reached for his hand, just briefly. One squeeze, a silent punctuation, and then she let go. Julian dropped her off at her place without ceremony. No promises, no future plans. Just a look that held everything unspoken and an exhale that almost said thank you. He didn't text, she didn't call. And yet neither of them moved on. They didn't rebound, they retreated, because sometimes, after something true, you need space to undo everything that came before it. Julian went back to his routines, writing, walking, drinking tea at the same cafe where he once wrote about people he'd never meet. Only now, none of those words landed the same. He tried to capture her in sentences, but every time he did, she slipped through. Because what they shared couldn't be written in a straight line. It was a spiral, a slow reveal, a half-remembered dream that had the audacity to stay vivid. So he stopped writing about her, and wrote to her instead. Not to send, just to understand. Noelle did the same. She pulled out the old leather journal she never let anyone see, and wrote a letter she promised herself she wouldn't mail. She began with, I thought we were just pretending. Turns out, the only part that wasn't real was the exit. She filled pages with memories, questions, and confessions. She asked herself what it meant to be known, and what it cost to disappear just when things started to feel clear. They both did this, in different places, at different hours. Unspoken mirrors, unsent letters, private reckonings. Weeks passed. The silence between them stretched, but it never snapped. Because some threads don't break, they just wait. And then one day, fate stepped in. Or maybe it was just timing. But when a friend sent Noelle a link to a small publisher's new anthology, stories written anonymously by first-time authors, her heart paused mid-beat. She knew that voice, that cadence, that unguarded way of saying everything without saying everything. And just a few pages later, there it was again. Her voice, on the page, facing his. They hadn't sent their letters, but somehow they had both submitted them. Chapter 13. What We Meant to Say. The anthology was called Confessions Between Lines, a curated collection of stories that weren't really stories. They were truths dressed in fiction, bound in soft matte cover, tucked on the back shelf of a bookstore that smelled like cedar and second chances. Noelle held the copy in her hands, fingertips hovering above the page number her friend had texted her. Start at 113. She did. The words were unmistakable. There was a woman who disappeared with me, not into hiding, into clarity. She didn't ask to be found, only felt, and I've been feeling her ever since. She read it 3 times, not to understand, but to believe. Julian had written it. Or maybe, more truthfully, he had finally let himself write her. Not as a character, not as a scene, but as the chapter that changed everything he thought he knew about connection. Across the city, Julian sat on his balcony with a copy of the same book, flipping past his own words to a page he hadn't expected to find. Page 129. Her voice. He let me pretend until I didn't need to, and when I finally told the truth, he didn't run. He stayed still long enough for me to hear myself. Julian exhaled. Deep, quiet. He closed the book, not out of shock, but reverence. She had written him back, not by email, not by phone, but in print, public, permanent, published. It was the most intimate thing she could have done, and she hadn't even used his name. They didn't reach out immediately. There was a strange comfort in knowing their truths had touched the same page, like a dialogue between ghosts who never really left. But the words lingered, and eventually they began to pull. 1 week later, Noelle walked into that same bookstore, the one her friend mentioned. She wasn't sure why. Maybe she hoped to run into him. Maybe she just wanted to feel the spine of the book one more time. What she didn't expect was to see it, sitting open on the staff recommendation table, flagged with a yellow note. 2 voices, 1 unfinished story. She smiled, and when she turned around, there he was, not approaching, not watching, just waiting, like the pause before a final paragraph. Their eyes met, the bookstore noise faded, and something unspoken passed between them again. Not hello. Not I missed you. Just this. I know what you meant. And this time, the page didn't turn without them. Chapter 14. The final chapter. They didn't talk right away. Julian stood there at the edge of the bookstore aisle, not moving. Noelle took a step, then another. When they finally closed the space between them, it was like that first night all over again. The airport, the glass of wine, the tension that said, "Don't touch this unless you mean it." But this time, they meant it. He reached for her hand. She let him. There was no need for small talk. They had already told each other everything, in letters, in glances, in silence, and in the pages of a book neither of them thought the other would ever read. So they walked. Out of the bookstore, out of the past, out of the places where pretending had been a kind of protection. They didn't move in together. They didn't rush a title. There were no declarations stamped in time. But they began. They met for tea in the early afternoons. They sent short voice notes instead of long messages. They left books on each other's doorsteps with one line underlined in pencil. They had weekends where they said everything, and nights where they barely spoke. but nothing between them was ever hollow again. Even their silence was full. One morning, Julian brought her a blank notebook. On the first page, he had written, "This time, no rolls, no edits, just us. Write with me." She looked at him, really looked, and knew this wasn't another beginning. It was a continuation of what never really ended, of what survived the distance, the silence, and the weight of almost. This time, they weren't characters. They weren't shadows in someone else's story. They weren't unsent messages or folded notes in a pocket. They were real, present, here. And the final chapter? It wasn't the end. It was the part where the writing stopped, because the living had finally begun.